Thanks, Michael, for that very generous introduction. And I'd love to claim credit for your Christian education, but unfortunately that was not one of our schools, I imagine. Is there room in our future for faith in Christian schools, faith in education? And as I think we learned in the very first session from Sarah, if we're going to look forward into what the future holds, we need to look back a little bit to see what the past can tell us. So I want to take you back to the very early days of our European colony in Australia. The founding of the Australian European settlement, going back to 1793, if the slide's going to come up. I've got the clicker, don't I? That would be why it's happening. Sorry. Now I've got myself organised, we'll get there. 1793, very first school in Australia. Very first school in Australia was a Christian school. Praise God for the Anglicans. All the Anglicans said yay. Reverend Richard Johnson started the very first Christian school in Australia. The Victorian education system celebrated 150 years earlier on, I think it was this year. We celebrate 200 years of Christian schooling in Australia back in 1993. And that plaque on the top left-hand corner of the screen is the plaque that's in Richard Johnson Square in the city of Sydney. So if you've got nothing else to do this afternoon after the conference, wandering on the city of Sydney, Richard Johnson Square, you can read the plaque after a march by Christian schools. 1872, Victoria. You're going to see a pattern about Victoria, aren't you? The Education Act was passed and started the government school system down there, public instruction. And that's where the whole notion of free, compulsory and secular education came into the vernacular in Australia. Free, compulsory and secular. But in that context, secular, all historians will tell you, and I'm sure Sarah will agree, was very much talking about non-sectarian. Not that hard secularism we see now. It was a non-sectarian education, not a non-religious education. But that free, compulsory, secular has been misconstrued over the years. Fast forward to 1962, the famous school strike in Goulburn, which established funding again for non-government schools. And this is where we can give the Catholic school parents a pat on the back. Yay for the Catholic schools. They all went on strike, threatened to take their kids out of local Catholic schools because the facilities were poor. There was no room for them in the government schools. And the government said, oops, we better give you some money to fix that up and continue the Catholic school education. To their enormous credit, the Catholic Church in Australia has continued its education through that process very vigorously. The Protestant schools, many of them were handed over to governments. There was some church schools ongoing. Many of the old church schools here in Sydney, King's School, Parramatta, some of the others around have a great long heritage. But in many ways, the Protestants left the field of Christian education. Our schools that I represent, the sort of contemporary Christian schools, started about 40 years or so ago. And they are characterised by really being very vibrant, very rich learning communities. The sort of thick communities that Steve was talking about earlier, where we want biblical principles and perspectives to underpin all the education across all the subjects in the school. And not only that, they're schools where the relationships are important. The relationships between staff and students, between staff and parents, models Christ-like behaviour so young people can be formed in that environment, grow up to know Christ, equipped not just for eternity but also for the common good in this world, but in that really deep, rich, loving, embracing Christian learning community. Sounds perfect, doesn't it? Never quite that perfect. In practice, we all make mistakes. The Adventist schools have a very similar model. The schools represented by AACS, my colleague Vanessa, very similar model. that very rich, deep, embedded Christian faith. Now, to do that, to provide that sort of education, we need to be ensuring that we can have the freedom to employ staff who model and promote those beliefs. Not just staff who will give lip service to it, but actually speak out of who they are, share their life, share their faith, talk in the classroom about what they did on the weekend, going to church, living a Christian life. The rich vibrancy of a 24/7 faith. We need to be able to teach what we believe, teach in accordance with our beliefs. And we need the freedom to be able to ensure that we can structure our schools and take management actions to protect those beliefs. Make sure that within our community we can continue to be that sort of rich, vibrant Christian community we want to be. All that's sounding good so far. And it's all theoretically protected in international law. When you look at the famous ICCPR, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 18, that many in this room are very familiar with, has already been mentioned earlier today. The rights we have under international law, the rights protected by international law, very broad and encompassing rights on their language, to have or to adopt a faith, to make sure that faith can be expressed individually or in community, in public or in private, to be manifest in worship, observance, practice and teaching. Fairly broad, sweeping protections, fairly strong protections given the language of international law. And if you look in particular, the bit that I get really excited about is Article 18.4 at the bottom there. The states parties to this covenant undertake to have respect for the liberty of parents and, where applicable, legal guardians, to ensure the religious and moral education of their children in conformity with their own convictions. The right of parents to choose a faith-based education, not just a Christian education, all applies to all faiths, but to choose that faith-based education. Because we know how essential that is, and it's an essential element of faith communities is to teach that to your children, to pass that on to the next generation, the faith we profess and believe. It's a key part of those protections, but it's one that not only seems to have been dropped off the little graphic on the right from the Australian Human Rights Commission, but also dropped off on the domestic law interpretations or statutes that give effect to these sort of protections. So in Victoria, you have the in ACT, first of all, start off with the Human Rights Act. Victoria, the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities Act. And then more recently in Queensland, the Human Rights Act. All domestic implementations of the ICCPR, all meant to, claiming to embed international human rights protections in Australian law, and all omitting that provision of 18.4. In none of them. They're all deficient. So, not looking too good for Australian implementation of international domestic protections for religious freedom. I have the joy in my job of going into schools and seeing young kids and seeing pictures of young kids like that. Isn't that beautiful? Can you imagine that young girl sitting there wondering whether she's a girl or a boy? The things we do to our kids. We need to protect our kids, allow them to be kids. Beautiful young children in our care. So we have these deficient Australian instruments. But wait, there's more. Not quite selling you steak knives, but they'll come close. In all of those pieces of legislation, they all have the ability to limit human rights. And they all do it differently to the international law. So if you look at international law in Article 18.3, it talks about the limitations being necessary and only on limited grounds. In each of the Australian human rights instruments, they all allow limitations where there are reasonable limits. Now, question for all lawyers in the room. Is necessary the same as reasonable? Which is higher? Necessary. Thank you. Is there a big difference? Yes. Thank you. You can all get up here and do this instead of me. There's a huge difference between Australian law and international law. We completely fail to meet the standards we've said we would under international law in every single implementation in Australian domestic law of these human rights instruments. So, doom and gloom after lunch. Where does that leave us? It doesn't quite leave us at the stage of perpetua felicitas. We're not getting, our bodies torn apart. We're not getting ourselves, our heads lopped off. But we're certainly playing an away game when it comes to the legal framework in Australia. Domestic protections for religious freedom are simply not up to snuff. We get the crumbs off the table. We get the crumbs off the table because the way that the law provides protections for freedoms in Australia is through exceptions and exemptions. Now, that is a poor legal mechanism. It's a poor legal mechanism because all of the bits of legislation where these exemptions are embodied within, are built within, have objects. The objects or the objectives or the purposes clause talk about what that bit of legislation is intended to do. It's the framework through which courts will interpret that legislation. And they all have objects similar to this one from the Victorian Equal Opportunity Act. The objectives of this Act are to eliminate discrimination to the greatest extent possible. So when you tell someone on the one hand you're going to eliminate things to the greatest extent possible, but then use a mechanism of exemptions to provide an essential balancing protection for religious freedom, does that sound like a fair compromise? To the average person, it doesn't. It sounds like a get-out-of-jail card, effectively. Despite the fact that the whole legislative framework is built on those exemptions to actually make the legislation work. There are 46 exemptions in the Victorian Equal Opportunity Act. There only seem to be a couple that are always focused on by legislators wanting to make changes. But the way the legislative framework works is they have these broad clauses that prohibit discrimination, but then to make the legislation workable, provide exemptions. It's a quarter of the whole Act is actually around exemptions. And continuing in Victoria, and Victoria is the model, so-called, for all the other jurisdictions in Australia, certainly the model for those who are wanting to stifle religious freedom. They passed changes in 2021 that come into effect, where they have changed the exemption for religious educational institutions and replaced a permanent exemption, a relatively unconditional exemption, with a far more conditional exemption. That's the language up there. For the non-lawyers in the room, let me highlight a couple of parts of it. For a Christian school or other faith-based school in Victoria, they need to show to be able to be exempt from the legislation, to be able to protect their religious freedom, because that's what these exemptions are about. They're really balancing clauses to protect religious freedom. They need to show that conformity with the doctrines is an essential requirement, inherent requirement of that role, of that position. They also need to show that the reason a person can't meet that inherent requirement is because of their religious belief or activity. And then, just because we want to make it even more difficult, you've also got to be able to demonstrate that your actions that you might take that are considered to be potentially discrimination are reasonable and proportionate in the circumstances. So, again, the lawyers in the room are going, that's just nuts, that's really hard, that's a lawyer's picnic. There are so many ways we can trip people up in this. And it is. And if you want to really get yourself tied up around this, and we will a little bit, let's look at some examples they use in the explanatory memorandum to the legislation, to the bill. And they very carefully consulted with a whole range of groups, completely ignored all our suggestions and the things we actually wanted to get them to do, and made sure that they've described all the problems we said would be created in the explanatory memorandum to prove that that's was their position. So, one example. In most religious schools, it would be an inherent requirement of religious education positions to conform with doctrines, but a support position unlikely to have a religious conformity as an inherent requirement. So immediately in their examples around the legislation, they're saying that there are some positions where you can and some you can't, and we don't think these ones you should. They're immediately imposing a view on what education looks like and how education should be provided on Christian schools. And really stacking the deck against you if you want to say, hang on, we're a learning community. It takes a village to raise a child. Everyone in this school needs to have a relationship, needs to have a faith. From the gardener to the cleaner, to the teacher, to the principal, to the headmaster. Everyone in our community needs to have a faith. That's how we do faith formation. The presumption they have is, no, not going to fly. Okay, not just testing these things on paper. It's not good enough to have in your employment contracts, in your role descriptions, in all the documentation around a particular position that this is an essential characteristic of this role that a person holds and adheres to and lives out and practices their faith. You've actually got to be able to demonstrate that in practice. And again, the lawyers are going, oh, there's a lot of work there. There's witnesses, there's cross-examination. There's all these sort of statements we're going to have to get on what actually happens on a day-to-day basis in a school. I'm going to be able to trip you up and make you fall with being a clever barrister in so many ways. That's what it's all about. The aim of the legislation, in my humble opinion, is less about actually prosecuting people, but more creating an environment where they stay so far within the line that they don't fall short of it or don't have it tested. Okay, if we weren't already worried enough, okay, you've got this role. You've convinced us that, for this particular role, we understand you need a person of faith in that role. That's great, we accept that. Oh, but hang on. 2 years ago, you appointed someone to this role on a temporary basis because you couldn't find a Christian and they weren't, so therefore it's just a preference. It's not actually an inherent requirement because once for a short period of time you didn't put someone in that role while you were looking for a suitable candidate. Again, just another example we spoke to them about and they've used against us to actually talk about how they want us to fail in meeting this test. And then they go on to reinforce this wonderful notion that there's a difference between a person possessing a protected attribute as distinct from a person holding a religious belief about a protected attribute. So let's talk about what we're actually talking about here when we're talking about protected attributes. So what this is saying is that if someone's if they have a particular sexual orientation, that's a protected attribute. They're saying that that's different from actually having a belief about that protected attribute. So, just because they are homosexual, that might not reflect their religious beliefs about homosexuality. So we're calling people out to be hypocrites. We're calling people out to be saying one thing but being, in the language of the legislation in Victoria, another thing. Talking about that false distinction between giving lip service to faith and their actual sexual orientation. Now, of course, we can have people who are same-sex attracted, who don't act on their same-sex attraction. We're not talking about that here. We're talking about people who are living that lifestyle, making those choices as we would understand them, around behaviour, but still saying that they hold a particular belief that's inconsistent with that. And they talk about not only the particular beliefs, but the particular beliefs applying to the role. And in chatting to them and trying to get some more clarity on what they were talking about here, they are talking about the role, the particular role in question. So, say you have a belief as a school, a doctrine as a school that holds to a traditional orthodox historical view of marriage, definition of marriage. That's fine. You say that that's an important doctrine for your school. They'll accept that. That's fine. But how is that actually relevant to the role of a kindergarten teacher? How much do you teach about marriage in kindergarten? Where's marriage in your kindergarten curriculum? Which term do you teach about marriage to the 4-year-old kids? Oh, you don't. Oh, well, that's clearly not relevant to this role. So your kindergarten teacher can believe whatever they want about marriage. Surely it's not an inherent requirement of that role. That's the sort of level of detail that they're wanting to get down into with this legislation. I'm hoping that the silence, well, is the silence because of fear, boredom, or is it just after lunch, or are you just all shocked by this? This is a pernicious government imposing pernicious requirements through pernicious law with a very clear target on people of faith. So another example they give. So you've got the situation where you've been able to ensure that religion is an inherent requirement of the role. You've convinced them of that. You've done the work to make sure that's part of all that. And let's imagine that one of those things is that teachers actually lead prayers in your school. And someone can't lead prayers anymore. They accepted that that can happen, that that's not appropriate, and you've sacked them because of that. You know, they've got they've lost their faith. They've turned away from their faith or something. Hang on, is that reasonable and proportionate? Maybe what you should have done is just got another teacher to lead prayer. So we've suddenly got 2 classes of teachers within our schools. The ones that lead prayer and the ones who don't believe our faith anymore, and they're fine to employ, but they just don't lead prayer. As if prayer is this narrow conception of what we believe Christian life is. And we all sit in this room and go, there's much more to our faith than that. But they're narrowing it down. You can see they're trying to slice off every little bit to make it as hard as possible for Christian schools in Victoria. Okay, so we'll get past that one with the example of prayer. What about someone who, there's a range of views around marriage in society. They're happy to teach your view and say it's your view, but they'll also say, look, the school's view is that marriage is between a man and woman, forever and covenant under God, blah, blah, blah. But, there are other views out there, Don't worry about that too much. That's going to be okay, according to the Victorian government. If you give lip service to the school's view, but then sort of just, teach them on the side or tell them on the side there's these other views around there, that's okay. That's the sort of thing that they're saying is going to be acceptable under the legislation in Victoria. And if you think for a moment that that's okay, you're in a church in Victoria, you're not a school, so you're safe, too bad. The changes in the legislation in Victoria also apply to employment in religious bodies more broadly. They haven't changed the provisions around the ordination or appointment of priests, ministers, rabbis, imams, etc. But they make it very clear that it does apply to other church employees, and they've made it very clear in their second reading speech, but that once you have these people in employment, and lawyers will know there's some technical issues around whether ministers of religion are actually employees or not. In some faith traditions they are, in some they aren't. Depends on how your actual denomination is structured. But if there was a pastor, a minister in a church who was an employee, they would expect they would be governed by those same employment provisions. All those examples I talked about in relation to schools would also apply in the context of churches in Victoria. Freedom! It's a great thing. Doesn't happen. And that's why the Religious Discrimination Bill was such a game changer, with its provision to override state-based legislation that ripped away fundamental human rights. And these provisions in Section 11 of the proposed federal bill got a lot of attention, got a lot of dispute. But seriously, how controversial is it for the federal government to say, we want these human rights to be protected and we don't want anyone else to take these rights away? Would people actually condone the federal government allowing states to take away disability discrimination rights, or race discrimination rights, or age discrimination rights? No one would ever propose that. But when it comes to religious discrimination, it suddenly became controversial. Love that word, controversial. Whenever you read the paper and something's classified as controversial, that's always a great test that it's a fundamental freedom being addressed there. You know, the controversial Lyle Shelton sitting over here in the corner. You know that someone doesn't like him, he's doing a great job for the kingdom of God or something when those sort of tags get used on your name. So that was one of the great things in the Religious Discrimination Bill, where it provided that national protection. It also provided for the first time some long overdue protections for people of faith that filled that gap for people of faith against discrimination. It also established that some conduct was not discrimination, reflecting international law where some legitimate differentiation is not discrimination. So it outlined that some conduct by religious bodies was not going to be religious discrimination. And it also confirmed, and I think this is one of the most overblown elements of the bill, confirmed that moderate statements of belief are not discrimination. Now, my understanding is that they probably weren't going to be discrimination anyway. All this did was actually confirm the law and make that clear and settled. But those provisions, very moderately drafted, some would say compromised beyond acceptability, were in the legislation. Again, they were described as being controversial, but they were quite moderate and balanced. So this bill had 2 exposure drafts, 13,000 submissions, consultations with groups all over the country. 2 parliamentary committees recommended that the bill be passed. There was no reduction or elimination or effect on existing discrimination law protections, but it died. The bill killers. We all focus on the moderate Liberals, but it was also Rebecca Sharkey who proposed the amendments. All the ALP lower house MPs who were in the chamber at the time who voted for the proposed amendments. The Independents, Haynes, Steggall, Wilkie, Greens, Bant, and the Libs, Reid, Archer, Zimmerman, Allen and Sharma. And they didn't actually oppose the bill itself. What they opposed, or what they did, was tie it to provisions in the Sex Discrimination Act. And we'll get to that in a minute. Where we've ended up in the federal parliament is... Whoops. Okay, sorry. I'm looking at my notes and I missed a page. So what they actually didn't oppose the Religious Discrimination Bill. They agreed to amendments to the Sex Discrimination Act. They are effectively a repeat of the failed Wong Bill from 2018, Wong 2.0. On the basis of false claims that LGBTI students have been expelled in faith-based schools around Australia, there was a selective leak of the expert panel on religious freedom, or parts of the expert panel. They didn't leak the whole report, just parts of it, for political purposes, in a bit of a payback around the Wentworth by-election. That created a whole range of claims around students being expelled, despite the fact that there's no evidence of that. And there were amendments proposed to the Sex Discrimination Act that would have completely eliminated a provision that provided protections to be able to teach and to conduct our schools in accordance with our beliefs around sexual orientation and gender identity. These were provisions introduced in 2013. They were so uncontroversial at the time, they weren't even dealt with in the main floor of the House. I went back to see who voted for them, to see whether those same MPs were voting, against them in these amendments. It wasn't actually debated on the floor of the House. It was all passed through the Federation Chamber, the second chamber of the House of Parliament that deals with all the non-controversial legislation. So now Shadow Attorney Mark Dreyfus was Attorney General at the time, and George Brandis, the opposition Shadow AG, supported these amendments and supported these exemptions in 2013. Roll forward 5 years, we've suddenly got claims that there's all these students being expelled, no evidence, no concerns raised over those 5 years. It was only in that political context of the Wentworth by-election. The exemptions go well beyond, the amendments go well beyond the expulsion of students. They go to what we teach. They were reviewed by Parliament in 2018, 2019. They were rejected at the time because of the unintended consequences. Despite all that, they got passed as part of the proposal of the package of legislation, and that's why the religious discrimination bill didn't go forward. The result of all these actions is that we've now got no federal protections for people of faith against religious discrimination. And for those students who are in faith-based schools, who may be struggling with issues around sexual orientation or gender identity, they've had this fear campaign they've been living with for the last 4 years without any resolution. It was a lose-lose. No one won out of this debate, except for Equality Australia. They say we had a win. They don't really care about the rights of LGBTI students in faith-based schools. We could have found a solution for their concerns. In fact, Christian schools have been proposing solutions for that since 2018. There's no desire to actually find a solution. They just want the war to continue and chop back the rights of faith-based schools. So we move now, after that debacle, pox on both their houses really for the whole of Parliament, into this election. We've had some media attention around the issues of women in sport. Again, controversial candidate, made some common sense statements in a fairly inflammatory way, I'll admit, but what I find really fascinating now is that we've got to a stage of the debate where the activists are saying that we can't have this debate, it's harmful. Yet Catherine Deves has said nothing about this issue during this debate. It's been the media just recycling old stuff and creating these concerns. We have leaders talk about common sense amendments and common sense provisions, but they're not reflected in discrimination law. We have vague promises around religious discrimination protections from both sides of politics. And we've seen, particularly over the Easter periods, the Christian and Orthodox Easter periods, lots of MPs just rediscovering their faith. So you can add being photographed with a priest or a rabbi or a minister to kissing babies during an election campaign as an essential element. This is despite having overwhelming public support for the rights of faith-based schools to employ staff who share their beliefs. Now, we're not talking about conning people into working in our schools. We're not twisting people's arms to come and work in our schools. We're not saying to people, come and work in our schools and then telling them what they need to believe. We're upfront about who we are and what we believe. we're making that clear up front. People have a choice. They come knowing who we are because they want to be part of the Christian learning communities that our schools represent. And in most cases, it goes really well. In some cases, it does end badly. They change their faith. They fall out from their faith. They have issues with their faith. I was asked on notice by one of the senators in the Senate hearings, it was meant to be a gotcha question. Have your schools ever sacked someone for a difference of belief around issues apart from LGBTI issues? I didn't actually have the data. We're not a system of schools, we don't collect that data. So went out to our schools, got some information back from our schools. The overwhelming number of people who'd been either left schools or encouraged to leave our schools by the school around issues where there's a difference of faith and belief or morality was around heterosexual behaviour, affairs, living outside, sexual activity outside of marriage. Was the overwhelming number of... There wasn't a lot anyway, but they were the vast majority, as you'd expect. In fact, there were more people in the... It's not an exhaustive survey, but more people in the data I was able to get from our schools who'd been terminated for other theological differences than had been terminated on the basis of differences over sexuality and gender identity. Differences around the role of women in leadership, differences around the role of the Bible, differences around how we should be using the Bible in a school. All the sort of... we've got lots of denominations in the room. We can find lots of ways we have differences as Christians between each other. We've had more people leaving on the basis of those sort of theological differences than we have around issues regarding sex and gender identity. It's talked up as if Christian schools spend all our time focusing on this issue. And we'll probably hear a little bit later in the panel session from one of the principals of one of our schools. This is an issue in our schools, but it's not the major issue in our schools. But it's the issue where our freedom's been eroded because of the sexual age in which we live, to borrow some famous person's terminology. So that's where we've ended up. So what does the future look like? If there are two books to read, apart from Patricia's one, if you've got children or grandchildren who you want to help them to understand their sexuality, Carl Trueman's book is a brilliant read, but it's look, everyone who has read it will know it's a little dense at times. I should have arranged a commission. You should have had the book out in the foyer. Being the Bad Guys, Steve McAlpine's book. It's a great book. It's a much easier read, not that it's dumbed down at all, I should say, but a really great encapsulation of the sort of cultural challenges we're living in. Because all the legal stuff is downstream of these cultural challenges. 10, 20, 15 years ago when I was first talking to MPs, they understood and they assumed a favourable view of Christendom and the sort of good we were doing. We were playing a home game. Beat up that metaphor, we've had it used today, so just ride that hobby horse. We were playing a home game 10 or 20 years ago. Now we're definitely playing an away game. They presume ill will. They presume bad faith. They presume that we are harmful because that's what they are repeatedly being told around people of faith. We need to be better in explaining who we are and what we're doing. We need to be able to expand and talk about a biblical view of flourishing. And when it comes to the sexualised world in which we live, the sort of information that Patricia's been able to share with us, the sort of pathway that transition takes people down, is that a flourishing life? And once you get the detail and explain that detail to people, there is no one who will say, yes, that is flourishing. That's a life we won't live. If you can get to explaining it to them, you'll be called transphobic after your first sentence, but that's okay. Persevere. Make sure we respond to the broader cultural narrative. make sure that we engage with our neighbours, engage with our family, engage with people outside church to talk about these issues. Again, reading books like Steve's book will help you, give you some ideas around how you might do some of that. And it'd be great if there's a follow-up book we could buy which tells us a solution for that. Is that coming out in the next couple of years? It is. Fantastic. There's another book you can look out for. And making sure as we do this, particularly coming from a Christian perspective, we also make sure we have the integrity to make space for minority religions. Being sensitive to the needs of our Jewish, our Muslim brothers and sisters. That we come with a collective position on some of these things, where we want a contest of ideas, a contest of belief, not imposing a theocracy upon our world.